Okay, let's start. And welcome to this very last panel of our conference. It's on basically preventing the worst, avoiding nuclear escalation today, deterrence, no first use, or new forms of diplomacy. We want to discuss the state of the nuclear order, nuclear crisis stability, and the factors that can lead to escalation or de-escalation of nuclear conflict. The aim of this panel is to collectively think and discuss the best ways in which we can diffuse the extremely dangerous situation the world is in right now, and try to restore or think about possibilities to restore, first of all, a decent nuclear stability, and then go forward to reduce nuclear dangers by limiting, reducing, and controlling nuclear armament and related technologies. We have assembled a great panel with a wide-ranging expertise, but in the interest of time, I will introduce them just briefly in alphabetical order. Jyri Lavikainen, who is a researcher in the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Amy Nelson, she is fellow of the Strobe Talbott Center for Security, Strategy and Technology of the Brookings Institution. Guy Roberts is a former US Undersecretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical and Biological Defense Programs. He's worked for NATO for quite some time. And last but not least, Tong, Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Christopher Daase. I'm Professor of International Organization at the Frankfurt University and co-director of the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Now, every panelist has about 10 minutes to present his or her view, and then we will have a short round of questions and answers, and then open up for a general discussion. So, Jyri, you're the first.
All right, thank you. I think I'll keep sitting here because I have notes on my laptop. So what I want to talk to you about is keeping within the theme of the panel, which is more or less which one of these might work the best, diplomacy, deterrence, or no first use. And my argument is more or less that it's deterrence and diplomacy, and no first use is rather ineffective often, not in all cases, but very often is. And in fact, it can increase and not decrease nuclear dangers in some very specific circumstances. So what I'm going to give you briefly is my critique of no first use policies for this purpose. Now, what the policy is, it's actually a bit like kind of like a flip side of the coin of deterrence in the way that it functions in many similar ways. You have to convince your potential adversary or enemy of something. Just like in deterrence, you have to convince them that you are going to do something. In no first use policy case, you're going to have to convince that you're not going to do something. Now, credibility is in the eye of the beholder, as Robert Jervis, who was a very eminent scholar of international relations, including nuclear issues, pointed out. So I may believe in my no first use policy, but the adversary may not. And that tends to make the policy ineffective at times, and also in a way not increasing anyone's security. Now the building blocks of no first use policy is more or less that you're already running an uphill battle in this, because any nuclear weapon is functionally capable of being used first. So if you want to convince your adversary, you have to convince that, well, it doesn't seem to make sense to use them first. Don't appeal to trust, appeal to reason in a way. So what you can do is you can have a nuclear arsenal of the size and composition where it wouldn't make sense for you to do anything with it first, which is a small survivable arsenal designed for what is called an assured retaliation strategy. So the arsenal looks like the kind of arsenal that only makes sense to use second. So you're retaliating on someone's first use instead of doing it. First use wouldn't be sensible because then you would lose soundly the entire confrontation, which is why your interest is not that, and your adversary understands this as well. Now, a second point is that your adversary probably it would be better if it was not too much worried about you as an offensive military threat. You don't appear expansionist, and your non-nuclear forces do not appear to facilitate a strategy where your nuclear coercion would seem to be effective, that is your coercion to actually use nuclear weapons first. Now, what additionally would help is that the image of the future war your adversary has is the kind where the adversary might think that, okay, this is unlikely to escalate advertently or inadvertently, which is quite complicated in today's very interconnected world where multiple factors affect the causes of military campaigns. Now, if you take a country that seems to have these types of prerequisites, the first example is India, and China used to be like this too. Now Chinese credibility to commitment is eroding no matter what it says, because there are increasing doubts in the mind of the potential adversary whether the policy will hold in times of crisis. Now, for example, if you take India, you have quite small nuclear arsenal in today's sizes. The primary adversary is Pakistan, which is conventionally weaker. So for India, it makes sense to have a no first use pledge because it can kind of expect that Pakistan understands the power imbalances and dynamics between them, and yet it seems to protect India for Pakistani nuclear coercion or first use in a case of offensive war. Now, what happens with regard to China, on the other hand, that the size and composition of arsenal is changing. Not only the numbers of the warheads, but also maybe even more importantly, the diversity of the arsenal. So there are kinds of weapons that we are being accustomed to see from countries such as Russia. It's not a copy of the Russian arsenal, but it looks more and more diverse and more effective, which means that no matter what the official strategy is, it can be used for other kinds of strategies as well, and these can be changed on the fly if need be. So what might be today's doctrine might not be the doctrine 5 years from now on. This is China's decision. And then there's the additional problem that the position of Taiwan appears more precarious, which creates certain doubts in the mind of the United States whether the situation is really so stable after all. Now, there are additional problems to no first use. You might include caveats in it. Now, Soviet Union, if I recall correctly, had them, for example, with regard to receiving a signal that NATO was about to use nuclear weapons first. And then you have the situation where non-nuclear attacks might be used against nuclear capability. Now, one could say that your no first use policy doesn't really apply when your nuclear capability is attacked, even if it's with non-nuclear weapons, which then kind of undermines the entire policy, because then you include many kinds of things that exclude the policy. And this might include also attacks on conventional weapon systems, such as, say, if Russia had a policy of no first use, attacks on Iskander missile systems, which are very important for its non-strategic nuclear capability as well. And now, this is perhaps one of the most important problems with the lack of credibility of no first use. It is one of the most powerful and scary nuclear threats to actually renounce your no first use pledge in the middle of a war. Imagine if Russia had a policy such as this, Ukraine had a successful counteroffensive against, say, Crimea, and then Russia said that we are going to have to abandon our previous policy because the situation is so severe. They wouldn't have to do anything. They wouldn't actually have to threaten anyone with, and yet everyone would understand that now things have changed for good. And the problem for policy is that they can do this if one has a policy like this, it can renounce it today, renounce it tomorrow, 10 years from now on, whenever they like, whenever it seems politically feasible to do it, which is why the credibility of no first use pledge is very dependent on the actual weapons one has, because those weapons change on a much slower pace, and you can see it beforehand and you can prepare for it. Now, finally, as a problem for the credibility issue here, You can have a no first use policy and still wage a conventional war of aggression under your nuclear shield. Again, using Russia as an example, if Russia had a policy of no first use, it would still be upholding it today because it is not firing nuclear weapons. Yet it is using nuclear deterrence as a tool, or nuclear coercion as a tool. So in this way, no first use policies wouldn't do much in many very serious circumstances, besides not being credible. And now finally, as I close and I hand it over to Amy, there might also be problems if the no first use policy is actually believed. Now, your adversary whom you're trying to convince, first of all, might think that because the other party is not going to use nuclear weapons first, I might win a conventional war and then start one, which might actually lead to nuclear use because one might change their minds if that kind of conventional war was in progress. And this pertains more to military strategy. Now, one of the best ways to achieve a breakthrough with ground forces is to concentrate them on a point in the front line and then overwhelm the enemy. The Russian military doctrine, for example, is exactly like this. What they do is they concentrate forces and concentrate especially artillery firepower. Now, the problem with this is that if you do this with the armored brigades and divisions, you create a very attractive target for a nuclear strike. Which is why in today's military environment, the ground forces operate in dispersed manner. This is how the Ukrainian ground forces, for example, operate. Now, if your adversary believes your no first use policy, logically speaking, it would concentrate the forces, and in doing so, it would actually encourage you to abandon the policy. Now, imagine if your country was about to lose that kind of engagement, and now it suddenly appears that you may be able to prevent it by using nuclear weapons first, despite your policy. The military would even possibly advise you to do it. Might say that this is our last chance to have a hope that our capital won't be occupied. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is maybe a bit wider point, which is that the issues pertaining to nuclear weapons are so complex that it is really possible to cause very unintended second-order effects if you commit to certain specific policies before you understand what the reality on the ground is. Now, this is also how deterrence works. Countries are really loath to commit to nuclear threats. Putin, for example, has not issued a single nuclear threat during the war in Ukraine where he actually has tied his hand and that he has to use nuclear weapons or the credibility is gone. What he instead does that, well, all weapons can be used to defend territorial integrity of Russia, and that United States created a precedent for this or that. But that is more or less empty talk in the sense because even though Russia can use all weapons, it can also not use them. So in my opinion, the no first use pledge tends to tie one's hands in a way that is probably not the best of ideas in some instances. Additionally, it doesn't enhance one's own security in any way because it doesn't bind your adversary to anything. But I think I'm going to close there and hand it over to Christopher and then around to Amy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Amy, thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I so rarely have occasions to use props in my talks, but I actually have a small collection of arms control paraphernalia. And yesterday, our host pointed out how she and her friends had made all these souvenirs for the Reykjavik summit. And she was not alone. There was this cottage industry. Reykjavik had never seen anything like this before, right? So there was this cottage industry of homemade souvenirs. And you too could probably find your own Reykjavik scarf from 1986 on eBay. I also have a dusty pink sweater with an outline of Iceland off it, which was very, very 1986. So there you go. Great. Well, I was asked to talk about escalation, and because I've been doing a lot of work and teaching on escalation and emerging technologies, I'm going in that direction. And what I wanted to do today was really kind of unpack this assumption that we make that emerging technologies are de facto destabilizing. And given this assumption, what does this mean for arms control and deterrence? So if we have a destabilizing emerging technology, is it a problem for arms control as well? Is it a problem for deterrence? Or is it a problem perhaps solvable by arms control? So I'm going to talk a little bit about strategic stability in the context of emerging technologies. I'm going to talk about what kind of problems for strategic stability we might be interested in when it comes to emerging technologies. And then I'll talk about how emerging tech fits into this framework, this really simple model above me. Namely, are emerging technologies disrupting strategic stability? Or are they operating, for example, on arms control and deterrence? So when we talk about strategic stability, there are three phases of this concept. The first is first strike stability, right? The incentive or the lack thereof to strike first. Absent an incentive to strike first, strategic stability in the first phase holds. Then we look at crisis stability, right? Crisis stability is shifting pieces on the chessboard, leading to a potential crisis where one side might misperceive, for example, and a conflict could break out, or where a crisis is not well managed and things continue to escalate. And finally, arms race stability. It's not the third phase, but it's a long-term kind of stability, right? The investments we make in emerging technologies or in extremely capable systems today result in arms race stability or lack thereof in the future. Okay, so turning back to our old friends Schelling and Halperin, we're going to define strategic stability as a stable nuclear balance that could help prevent conflict by creating a situation where neither side has an incentive to initiate nuclear war. So we're talking about first strike stability here. And then strategic interactions among nations are characterized by a reduced likelihood of conflict escalation and increased confidence in the predictability of outcomes. That is crisis stability. These concepts are all derived from game theory, which says that a stable set of equilibria is a minimum closed set of equilibria such that small perturbations of the game have equilibria close to the stable set. The system stays the same, right? Nothing really knocks anything out of proportion, of control in a way that the system can't recover from, right? So this is the fundamental concept behind strategic stability. All right, so to explain this diagram a bit, strategic stability is codified and maintained by a combination of arms control and deterrence. And all of these components have some relationship to each other. And so challenges for deterrence and arms control that we may or may not be experiencing today mean challenges for strategic stability because these concepts are connected. All right, so now let's talk about emerging tech. Is it operating on strategic stability? Is it affecting arms control? Is it affecting deterrence? Is it all three? Well, as I open the talk with, we often hear about how emerging technologies are destabilizing. We worry about emerging technologies because they create new opportunities, new pathways to conflict. They have the potential to upset the balance of power, to disrupt international relations, and to lead to new forms of conflict. And these are all pulled from various pieces of scholarship on the subject. Likewise, technological advancements may influence state behavior, alliances, conflict resolution, and they can reshape global power dynamics. So what that is saying is it's throwing our stable system out of whack. All right, and so one of my favorite descriptions for how emerging technologies and strategic stability come together comes from Rebecca Hersman's 2020 piece on escalation wormholes. These are sudden, unpredictable failures of the fabric of deterrence, so now we're in the lower right corner, that cause rapid escalation to strategic conflict. So we go from the lower right corner to the top of the pyramid, and that is the pathway of perturbation in the system. And she argues that increasingly capable and intrusive digital information technologies, advanced dual-use military capabilities, and diffused global power structures are going to reshape future crises and conflicts between nuclear-armed adversaries and challenge traditional ways of thinking about escalation and stability. The emerging security environment will require, therefore, new concepts and tools to manage the risk of unintended escalation and to reduce nuclear dangers. So that is a tall order. Those are really big marching orders there. So what are some examples of this? Well, cyber weapons create instability at lower levels of conflict. The onset of the conflict happens at a lower level, right? And to some extent, we're always in some amount of cyber conflict, right? This is the gray zone. This is a hybrid warfare, right? This is our continual, U.S. Cyber Command says we're in a defend forward position. We're constantly defending from cyber attacks, right? So if the threshold for conflict is lower, more likely it's gonna initiate and therefore continue or escalate. AI is also driving a technological arms race that is destabilizing, right? We don't know what everyone's AI capabilities will be in the end, so we are investing heavily now to win at what, I'm not sure, right? But that this is destabilizing. Likewise, AI-based systems, so these are actual weapon systems that are deployed or deployable or have the capacity to be converted from partially autonomous to fully autonomous. Lethal autonomous weapon systems create instability by accelerating the speed of warfare through decreased human control, so another pathway to instability. And hypersonics have been charged with causing arms race instability, among other things. So we seem to have a problem at the top of the pyramid here, right? Strategic stability was this, The End of Strategic Stability is a great book on the subject. It was derived for a simpler era, Cold War, bipolar stability, where two sides would compete for global influence but would be mutually deterred from using nuclear weapons, right? Now we have all those other weapons creating all kinds of other problems. And the book talks about how nuclear powers, regional rivalries, and non-state actors can now punch above their weight, right? So the whole strategic stability system is kind of changing. And then the US Department of State issued its ISAB report that talked about the potential for strategic instability and called for renewing both arms control and deterrence to shore up strategic stability at the top level, right? So we clearly are struggling with this strategic stability at the hands of emerging technologies. All right, well, what about deterrence? Well, the ISAB report also called out current challenges in deterrence and talked about the need to tailor it for multipolarity, to tailor it to deter aggression in regional fora against opportunistic aggression and collusion, and from the potential for escalation from conventional nuclear integration, dual capable systems, and investments in emerging technologies, right? So the report is clearly calling out the potential for escalation from emerging technologies and the need for deterrence to do better in this area. So it's looking an awful lot like we have a deterrence problem from emerging technologies. Well, do emerging technologies erode deterrence in a way that creates problems for the existing arms control architecture? And are there deterrence problems from emerging technologies that arms control can solve? And I ask because I think we get very confused. We lump emerging technologies and arms control together, but we're not always sure why or how the two pieces fit together. So now I'll ask, do emerging technologies pose a problem for arms control? Well, as I said, these are increasingly paired concepts. Why? Well, arms control is a set of foreign policies or security tools, as well as a school of study. And when we consider it as a school of study, it makes sense to lump them together. Academically, these are shared concepts, and arms control focuses on limiting dangerous weapons, right? But we can do better, I think. We can better understand the relationship between arms control and emerging technologies to better align foreign policy and make use of arms control. Well, how do we do that? Well, I argue that arms control regimes are being eroded, actually, by emerging technologies. The increased rate of production of novel military and civilian technologies, often dual use in nature, combined with digitization, which facilitates their spread, increases diffusion and contributes to latency. Arms control was designed to manage physical weapons emerging at a manageable rate. Many arms control agreements bargain away last generation weapons, and confidence and security building measures rely on what can be seen and counted. Emerging technologies also stand to disrupt the balance of strategic stability previously pursued and codified arms control. So problem number 2, think of the bottom of the pyramid relating to the top of the pyramid. Their newness combined with their lack of being regulated incites fear, with arms control presumed the mitigating solution. And I'll ask you whether you think this is justified. And so we fear them because we fear that they open up new pathways for conflict and new mechanisms for escalation. And finally, the third problem at the intersection of emerging tech and arms control, emerging tech arms races undue progress made by strategic arms control, right? When you have increasingly potent, increasingly capable, increasingly accurate conventional systems, for example, any gains, stabilizing gains made by arms control for strategic nuclear weapons are eroded. So, putting it all together, challenges in arms control and non-proliferation efforts from dual-use technologies operate on arms control and present a challenge to existing arms control regimes. The need for international cooperation to manage technological risks at a time when international cooperation is hard to get is an impediment to arms control. However, potential for new arms races, this is a challenge for arms control. In other words, this is a challenge that arms control is equipped to solve in certain cases. The potential for new pathways to conflict, likewise, a challenge for arms control. A challenge arms control is equipped to solve where emerging technologies are concerned. The potential for new pathways for escalation, this is also a challenge for arms control. So what I'm advocating for is that we be much clearer in establishing our relationship between emerging technologies and arms control so that we can better understand how to judiciously apply arms control in the field of emerging technologies when, and this is critical, there currently exists no arms control for emerging technologies. So here we've seen how emerging technologies can affect strategic stability, how they can affect arms control, and how they can affect deterrence. And so when we talk about avoiding escalation from emerging technology, we want to consider all three: strategic stability, arms control, and deterrence. And when we talk about managing strategic stability from the effects of emerging tech, we want to be really careful about which phase of strategic stability we're talking about here. Additionally, I would suggest that there are other ways to precise our approaches in this slide here. And I advocate for what I call arms control as uncertainty management, that the most effective use of the tool of arms control today is to reduce the risk of conflict, reduce the potential for escalation, and the pressure to arms race as a function of the information that is shared. Thank you.
Thank you for a very dense and interesting talk. Okay. Let's see here.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, I want to thank the organizers for sending me an invitation to have an opportunity to speak with you all. And had a wonderful time yesterday. In fact, I was just thinking about where we were. It would be probably good to have the Conference on Disarmament meet in the Sky Lagoon from now on. The mellowness and the flow of camaraderie was such that really is no substitute for that, and I think that's the way we ought to go from the future. But I'm going to talk about the broader perspectives with regard to arms control and some of the historical aspects of it, because number one, I don't think people study the historical aspects of these things, and number two, it's very important to understand where we were to why we are where we are today. And as we all know, today is not a very pleasant picture. But before I begin, let me say a couple of things regarding NATO. As you know, NATO is a nuclear alliance, and it will always be a nuclear alliance. And until nuclear weapons go away, NATO will always have nuclear weapons. Let me say that right up front. And after 6 years of being at NATO and being the director of nuclear policy, and after looking at the numerous strategic concepts that we've developed over the last 40 years, it should be clear to everyone that NATO is not prepared to give up nuclear weapons. And given the circumstance today, we will continue to be in that mode. And why is that? Well, the answer is this is the 75th anniversary of NATO. And during that period of time, the greatest collective security organization in the history of mankind has managed to keep the peace. It has stimulated an area of economic growth and prosperity unmatched in human history. The rule-based international legal order, as you all know, is being challenged. And what we are facing is a return of great power competition and use of force and intimidation to be the rule of the day. We've rejected that. We paid a very high price to have the prosperity and economic freedoms that we have. And I, for one, am certainly not willing to give it up, and hopefully neither will you. It's also the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and which we defeated another ideology that was challenging world order. On the other flip side, this is the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. 800,000 people died in a little over a month. There wasn't a nuclear weapon, a landmine, a cluster munition, an incendiary weapon to be found. There were a lot of machetes and clubs with spikes in them. And that is a representative, in my mind, of the duality of man, as was reflected in, oops, if I can get there, this statement by President Obama when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. Again, we need to reflect upon the fact that no matter how much progress we made, this is the duality of man. This is the nature of man. There is evil out in the world, and we have to face up to it. And it takes itself many forms, including a leader that thinks that aggression and intimidation is the way things should go as he builds a new empire in what is today Russia. It's also reflected in just general the hatred that we see in the world today. I got to remember how to do this. It's an interesting little picture. This is a Hamas training camp two years ago. The little guy on the left there, I was told, is about 5 years old. And 10 years from now, when they have the next invasion of Russia, we'll see all these folks doing all the kinds of things that we've heard about and read about. It's there, it's ever prevalent, and we should never forget the fact that we live in a world in which evil exists. And I think it's very important to keep in mind when you look at the negotiations in arms control, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And speaking of that, let me just, oops, I can't get this right. All right. Okay. One question, before we get to that, though, I think it's worthwhile just talking a bit about, or just reminding, and I refer to you to Tom Schelling and Mort Albert's book, Strategy in Arms Control, which he got a Nobel Prize for writing it about arms control. The objectives of arms control, and I'm saying this because I want to make a distinction between disarmament. The objections is reducing the likelihood of war, reducing the political and economic costs of war, and minimizing the scope and violence when it occurs. The assumptions are that it enhances our national security. It was made in the context of superpower competition, and that those superpowers shared a common interest in avoiding war, and arms control and military strategy should work together to provide national security. Arms control is not an end of itself, but a means to an end, And that end was first and foremost to enhance our national security, especially security against nuclear war. Some of the aims of arms control and military strategy could be the same. Indeed, they need to keep in mind the important factors that any government considers as it develops a national security strategy, and that is the requirement of deterring a potential adversary, the wartime military utility of particular weapons in specific circumstances, and the fact that there are other foreign policy goals than disarmament. So, who stopped us from Armageddon? Let's go back and look at some of the history. You got a statement by Alfred Nobel. I wish she could come up with something that would be so terrible that we would never go to war. And then a gentleman by the name of Norman Angell wrote a book called The Great Illusion. I recommend it to you because he goes on. It was written in 1908, 1910. There's 2 editions. He won a Nobel Prize as well, in which he argued that war was impossible. And it was impossible because it would cost too much. After 2 world wars, he transformed himself from being an idealistic pacifist to a believer in collective security schemes, and finally to support the Transatlantic Collective Defense Alliance. And this is in many ways a mirror image of what we see today. After he witnessed 2 world wars and seen the mayhem inflicted by excessive nationalism and totalitarian ideologies, the world's best-known peace activists at the time realized that an alliance between the Western democracies was the best model to stop that kind of violence. Andrew Carnegie, you may not know who he is. He was one of America's first billionaires, and he spent all of his money building libraries throughout the United States, but he also spent the money to build the Peace Palace in The Hague. And at that opening ceremony, he made this statement, thinking that we're not going to have any more wars, and everything will be great, and didn't quite turn out that way. This is a quote from another Nobel Prize winner. He was the director of the department section of the League of Nations on disarmament, and his view was this one, that it's not the weapon itself, but the attitude, and if you change the attitude, then you won't need those kinds of weapons. So most of the disarmament agenda is putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. I don't know if I'd run around without any clothes on, but nevertheless, that was a good analogy. And the ambassador to the Soviet Union at the time, after World War II, George Kennan, you may not know who he is, but he was the person that authored a very famous article in Foreign Affairs signed by X about establishing what we came to be called in the Cold War the containment policy. And that policy was pretty much U.S. policy throughout the Cold War. He didn't have a very strong view or big view about arms control, and his experience after many, many years of negotiating with the Russians was, as you see here. The real things happening today are the rise of revisionist nuclear powers that have no interest in disarmament and very little interest in arms control, and they use their nuclear weapons to challenge the status quo and change it according to a worldview characterized by great power domination and competition. And this is the country that George Kennan was talking about, Russia. And let's look at the record. The record, as we've already alluded to, is not a very happy one. Doggone it. Here's a record of treaty noncompliance. I'm hard-pressed to find a treaty that they haven't not violated. Every single treaty, arms control treaty, that we've had with the Russians have resulted in their noncompliance, in both legally binding and politically binding agreements. You are probably familiar, because it's got a lot of publicity, the Budapest Memorandum, and that was the memorandum in which the United States, UK, and Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. That didn't turn out too well, so you could argue it's only a politically binding arrangement. But then in 1987, Ukraine and Russia signed a treaty of friendship in which, again, Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. And then, of course, after they invaded the Crimea, that treaty was terminated. And President Biden has stated that he is, quote, ready to expeditiously negotiate a new arms control framework to replace New START when it expires in 2026, but those negotiations requires a willing partner operating in good faith. Russia has demonstrated over and over and over that it is neither a willing partner nor operating in good faith. Under these circumstances, negotiations would be theater without any substance. And you would have, going back to that definition of arms control, you would have a failure of arms control or ability to negotiate any such agreement. The conundrum of arms control is the two things that I consider the most important in any arms control treaty, and that is verification and compliance. And it's absolutely critical that you be able to verify, particularly if you're dealing with a country that is known for violating every agreement that is ever negotiated in this area, that you have some verification process that ensures full verification. Usually, in most cases, that amounts to a go anywhere, go any place, anytime inspection regime. That has been a real challenge. We were able to negotiate such a regime with managed access provisions in the Chemical Weapons Convention, but that remains a fundamental basis of a verification policy. But even more critical is what to do in the event of you find a violation. That has proven to be an even greater challenge, because without the ability to actually incur costs for that violation, your treaty and your obligations under that treaty lack teeth. Okay. Let's go here to the next slide. A question comes up about deterrence, and I constantly have to, and we've already alluded to the complicated nature of deterrence. And deterrence is, and I love this quote from Albert Einstein about it's even more complicated than physics, and it's just shows you how the complicated nature of building and constructing a deterrence regime that is effective. Deterrence is not and cannot be just bluff. In order for deterrence to be effective, we must not merely have weapons. We must be perceived to be able and prepared, if necessary, to use them effectively against the key elements of an adversary's power. Deterrence is not an abstract notion amenable to simulate quantification. Still less is it is a mirror of what would deter ourselves. Defense or deterrence is the set of beliefs in the minds of the enemy leaders about whether or not deterrence is effective. And that's a real challenge. We oftentimes, especially I believe Americans, tend to mirror image. That is, if someone speaks English and they kind of look like us, then they think like us, and that's absolutely not the case. And we have to ferret out the values and attitudes about our adversary and act in concert with that. When we were negotiating the Moscow Treaty, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time, and we were negotiating with the Russians, and we decided we were going to have a meeting in Geneva, and I was detailed to go and make all the arrangements for setting up the meeting. At that meeting, since we had now made a policy statement that Russia was no longer an adversary and we were going to have a collegial and cooperative relationship, so I set up the negotiating table with the two leaders at the front and the delegations down both sides. And the Russians showed up and absolutely refused. They said, no, we have to have across the table like this. So I had to rearrange everything so the leaders could be across the table. And then our chief negotiator started talking about, a new relationship, and he said, you're no longer an adversary, and we're going to treat you just like every other nation in the world, and we're looking forward to that. And the Russian's face started getting redder and redder and redder and redder, and I thought he was going to explode. And I couldn't figure out what was the problem. The problem was they didn't want to be treated like that. They wanted to be treated like a superpower. They wanted to have this special relationship. And one of the lessons learned from there is you got to know your enemy or know your competitor. What is their cultural views? How do they feel about these kinds of things? And take that into account when you're doing things. I thought this was the right way to go, and it turned out to be absolute wrong way to go. So it's important to know from those many perspectives. The question came up about how effective is deterrence. Okay, I'm almost done. If you go back to the treaties of Westphalia in 1648 and you look at the history of violence, you can see that casualties of war were over 2% of the world's population. World War I, about 25 million. World War II, well over 50 million. And then in 1945, something happened. What was that? I would submit to you it's NATO and nuclear weapons that have prevented great power war ever since 1945. Now, you have to ask yourself, too, and I think it's important to ask yourself, well, if you don't have nuclear weapons and there were none in the world, what would that world look like from a strategic standpoint? Would it look like August 1914? Would it look like September 1939? There weren't any nuclear weapons then. Would we be faced with the World War III if you looked at and extrapolated where maybe 300, 400, 500 million people would die as a result of great power war? It's something to think about. There is a book that has just been published by, Jacobson, called, and this has become very popular in the United States, called Nuclear War. And it's rife with mistakes and errors and positing a radical version of what possibly could happen. So I just wanted to lay out just some of the bullets there, points about U.S. deterrent policy. First, there is no launch on warning policy. There's no hair trigger alert. I hear that all the time, nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, and that's absolutely not the case. There is no policy of automatic retaliation if attacked. I've been involved in a couple dozen of nuclear exercises, and at no time has that ever come up. The U.S. has no plans to preemptively attack anyone. We can't predict the kind of wars that we would be in. We never, since Vietnam, we've never predicted any of the wars that the United States has been in. The U.S. And collectively NATO does not believe a nuclear war can be won, and we said that over and over and over again. But yet it comes up that we're a war-fighting nuclear nation when we're a defensive posture. And the aim of U.S. deterrent policy is to prevent any use of nuclear force in conflict. Okay, let me just say, a final thought, one of my favorite quotes from President Teddy Roosevelt, but ultimately, soft power doesn't work with hard power. The axiom that was mentioned earlier, sic vis pacem parabellum, applies. If you really want peace, you have to prepare for war, be prepared for it, and by being prepared, you raise the cost to the extent that in the cost-benefit calculus of our adversaries, it always comes out as a negative. And with that, I'll leave you for future questions.
Thank you so much. I'll try to offer a few thoughts on how to prevent the initiation of war, and if war starts, how to prevent escalation, since the prevention of escalation is the theme of this panel. I think there's a great need for us to try to address the rivalry among the major powers, which is increasing today. A major driver of the risk of war and escalation is that the major powers increasingly disagree who is on the right side of history, whose cause is more righteous. And in terms of who is wrong, who is right, we face a fundamental challenge, which is there is a wide and growing information and perception gap at the societal level between the major powers. They increasingly disagree on basic factual issues. Without addressing those fundamental problems, I think we leave the risk of war widely open. Maybe at least we could start discussing common sense principles of behaviors by the major powers. For example, as a bare minimum, maybe we can discuss a joint commitment to the basic principle of not using force to change territorial status quo. Many countries, including even major powers, continue rejecting the basic common sense principle, without which it's hard to diffuse arms race and to prevent the occurrence of conflict. Perhaps that issues like that should be the focus of the international community. I see a great need for the international community to jointly and preemptively raise the bar for initiating war and to jointly reduce incentives to invest in weapons, conventional and nuclear. Today, the world laments the human casualties in conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. And if we think about the next possible major war, being it over in Korean Peninsula or across the Taiwan Strait, those would happen over similarly populated areas with huge potential for civilian casualties. And the casualties in Ukraine and Gaza would be wasted if the international community will not try to learn lessons and again preemptively set high enough humanitarian standards to regulate war behaviors. We should think about how to minimize civilian casualties in a conflict in order to make it harder for countries to start a conflict. And when it comes to nuclear escalation, how do we minimize the nuclear consequences of a major conflict in a conflict between either US and China over Taiwan or US-Russia in Europe? The consequences of nuclear use would certainly not be contained within their bilateral boundaries. The fallout and other impact on the environment, on public health, will affect many countries that are no party to the conflict. There seems to be a great need for greater international attention and pressure on these issues so that nuclear-armed countries wouldn't dare to so freely threaten nuclear use. I think that's the best chance, that's the best deterrence against the war and against the nuclear escalation. We talked about no first use as another technical measure to prevent nuclear escalation. China has been promoting no first use for decades, but has really intensified its efforts to promote no first use in recent months and couple of years. On the one hand, China seems to genuinely believe that no first use is a necessary step to reduce the significance of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, China wants to use no first use to promote international image as a responsible power. And China probably knows that the US in particular is not going to engage on this topic, which further enhances Chinese moral high ground. The US has real concerns about the issue of no first use, not least because the US doesn't trust the credibility of Chinese nuclear deterrence, which is a rhetorical, declaratory policy that cannot be verified. And especially as China expands its nuclear arsenal, it's even harder to square the very restrained policy of no first use and increasing larger, more diversified nuclear arsenal. However, I think the distrust about no first use is mutual. When President Obama and Biden expressed certain interest in the issue of sole purpose or no first use, many Chinese experts reacted with a lot of suspicion about the credibility of American no first use once adopted. So it looks to me that there is a good opportunity to have a generic discussion about what constitutes credible no first use commitment. How to make sure a country's specific nuclear capabilities, operational postures, and domestic nuclear authorization mechanisms are aligned with a credible no first use declaration. Those general issues can and should be discussed today without making any country be prepared to change its existing nuclear policy. And that's a necessary step to discuss officially adopting no first use for any additional country. And of course, another major concern is US adoption of no first use could embolden Chinese conventional level military aggression, the typical stability-instability paradox. And I think a discussion about no first use could be an opportunity to encourage countries like China to provide conventional reassurance to US allies, Japan, South Korea, who are particularly worried about the destabilizing impact of US no first use. So those conventional reassurances are helpful to prevent both conventional and nuclear escalation. Looking into the future, I see two trends. One is the geopolitical rivalry among major powers continues to grow. And the other is some of the major powers are becoming more and more authoritarian, and their domestic systems are increasingly secretive. Both trends impose serious limits to arms control cooperation. And therefore, it may be hard to imagine tangible arms control negotiation in the near-term future. But that also means perhaps the most effective and realistic way to influence the policy and thinking of nuclear powers is to raise international awareness of the escalation risks. And if countries can genuinely believe and appreciate the escalation risks, that will create good incentive for them to adopt unilateral measures to reduce the risk of inadvertent escalation. And there are many things that can be discussed in this area, including how new technologies, hypersonic missiles, for example, might introduce new escalation pathways, how certain nuclear postures, like launch on warning, might contribute to inadvertent escalation, how specific capabilities, like the entanglement between nuclear and military weapon systems, might increase misunderstanding and escalation risk. And again, I see a major role here for the international community to play. For example, both to encourage and promote deeper research over these issues, to make more effective advocacy activities, to raise international awareness and pressure, and efforts at both the governmental level and the civil society levels can be very useful. And with that, let me stop. Thank you.
Running out of time, and if we want to bring in the audience into the discussion, maybe I should restrict myself to one general question to all of you. Maybe what should be the priority of states and the international community to prevent nuclear escalation and to strengthen strategic stability? What should be the priority?
Okay, thank you. I can start with a really quick remark on the diplomacy front. Maybe not the priority, but a priority, because the one thing that I think all nuclear powers, even enemies, can agree on is that nobody wants this to start by an accident. Nobody wants to strike a target and then cause something that they did not even expect to happen, which is why military to military contacts are extremely important between adversarial nations, and contacts where doctrines are discussed and clarified, and also where contacts where each side has a chance to explain that what are their key threat perceptions, what are the key systems that they definitely want to preserve. For example, I would imagine that space-based capabilities would be pretty high on the list, and I think it's important that countries understand at least the perspective of the other. Because there are cases where adversaries have very strange ideas of what the other party actually is doing or plans to do. I won't go into details, but there are so many of them.
So military to military communication.
Yes, also civilians should talk also.
Great, thank you. I think it's really important to remind ourselves regularly that deterrence and strategic stability are concepts. They don't actually exist anywhere. And the more we move forward, the more it becomes true that the only constant is change. And so when these concepts were originally forged, the world was a much simpler place. And not only was it a simpler place such that it was possible to capture the essence of the security environment within these concepts, we were able to develop shared understandings with the Soviet Union, between the Soviet Union and the United States. So with all that in mind, I would say that we should be very alarmed right now that we potentially no longer share these concepts with our adversaries. And so whatever work we can do through diplomacy, through shared war games, for example, tabletop exercises, simulations, all of the tools we have at our disposal, whatever we can do to enhance the development of these concepts for the current security environment and the mutual understanding of these concepts, I think would be a boon to international security.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. There was one of my questions to you. Deterrence has changed
Well, I agree with that, but again, I think that the key element is dialogue, being able to have a conversation. But it's challenging when you have an adversary that isn't willing to engage in that dialogue, someone who's a paranoid bully with an inferiority complex that is bent on building an empire. And frankly, given what I've seen in the last 40 years, the only way to respond to that is with strength. And we're going through a process right now where we're modernizing our nuclear deterrent with the goal of being able to not only deal from a position of strength with Russia, but China, which is a very unique, first time ever, where we're facing two peer competitors. And it's really a challenge that I think, Putin isn't going to be there forever. We have to build and construct a barrier, if you will, that again points out that any attempt at aggression you're going to pay a terrible price for it. And that message has to be conveyed in very overt and covert ways.
Well, since Mr. Roberts mentioned China, I just want to make a point that not every challenge has a military solution. I'm going to publish a report at Carnegie basically to explain that the Chinese current nuclear buildup may not necessarily be directly driven by a clearly thought out, clearly defined military objective, but it could be a result of ambiguous, untested political belief held by the Chinese paramount leader that a bigger nuclear arsenal could somehow have a broad geopolitical leverage that is useful for China in the major power competition. So the first thing is to understand the political nature of the challenge. That doesn't mean it's a lesser challenge. It's a different type of challenge. And if the nature is more political than military, then we need different tools to more effectively counter that or address it. And the good news is if indeed the challenge is more political in nature, again, there is a greater role for the rest of the international community to make an influence. Whereas if countries focus too much on the military countermeasures without understanding the Chinese internal perception thinking, there's a risk that some type of military countermeasures could further feed into the threat perception in Beijing and cause even more destabilizing action-reaction cycles.
I'd like to make one little comment about that from a NATO perspective. We've said over and over again that our nuclear deterrent is, well, we use our nuclear deterrent every single day. We use nuclear weapons every single day because they are political, not military. But in order to do that, you got to have, in the ladder of escalation, you got to have responses that, again, demonstrate at each level you pay a terrible price for aggression.
I just actually wanted to plug Tong. Tong has a really great piece in Foreign Affairs that just came out on the topic on which he was speaking, and I think that we can't pay too much attention to this issue right now, and there's a very dangerous rhetoric happening in the United States, and it's getting louder and louder, where we are kind of mentally constructing this ongoing active war with China, and that we must win it. And so pieces like Tong's that shed light on other ways of looking at the problem that really bring new information to the table, I think are really important.
Thank you. Thank you for the advice. I would like to open up the discussion a little bit, because we should have 15 minutes time for a general debate. Who would like to go first?
Thank you so much, Valeria Hesse, the Daase Center for Non-Proliferation. First off, thank you so much for the brilliant points of discussion. I wanted to pinpoint some logical fallacy in what Jyri said, that no first-use policy would not change the fact that Russia would still be able to threaten with nuclear weapons. Well, it would just then mean that it doesn't have the no first-use policy, because if you adopt it, it means that you cannot use those threats. I fully agree that sometimes you are forced to respond with hard power, which we have seen in the case of Ukraine. And here I want to go back to the Honorable Guy Roberts, that you mentioned that NATO is and will be a nuclear alliance, and that with the international norms that are not being respected, and nukes remain the only thing that prevents the war. Does that mean that those who do not have them and are not members of a nuclear alliance should get nuclear weapons or join a nuclear alliance? And I'm remembering Iran and North Korea here, and their kind of picture on the global scale. And if we think about your graph that showed the cutoff of the silent for the casualties after the appearance of the nuclear weapons on the global map, we have seen that non-nuclear states can face mass casualties from a war of aggression shielded by nuclear weapons, not through deterrence, but through compellence. And in this sense, nuclear weapons killed so many people without even being used because they were abused by Russia. So how do you see this playing out in the equation that you have built? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. During my time at NATO, we added 7 new nations, and every single one of those nations that joined the alliance made a specific reference to the nuclear umbrella. That was a key element of their reason for joining, and seeing great utility in doing that. On the flip side of that, it also, the nuclear umbrella has been a very good non-proliferation tool. We have several countries that are basically virtual nuclear weapon states. They have the capability, if they wanted to, make the political decision that they could be a nuclear weapon state. They've chosen not to because of that nuclear umbrella. Likewise, worldwide, most of the world is covered by nuclear weapon-free zones. The only areas really that aren't are the Middle East, but all of the southern hemisphere is a nuclear weapon-free zone. Even a little-known fact, what used to be called East Germany is a nuclear weapon-free zone. When we negotiated the reunification, one of the stipulations was we would not put nuclear weapons in that territory of East Germany. It's one of those little factoids, if you will. And Mongolia is a nuclear weapon-free zone. And so most countries, most places in the world, firmly believe that that's not part of their strategic stability in that particular region. And many of those countries, Argentina and Brazil being one of them, have given up a nuclear weapon program because of that. So there's a great, on the other hand, we have countries like Turkey, which has talked openly about having a nuclear weapon, and Saudi Arabia, which has talked openly about having a nuclear weapon, particularly if the perception is Iran acquires a nuclear capability. And that's very worrisome, because we all believe that we want to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons where it's at, and work towards the eventual elimination when the strategic situation calls for it.
Yeah, very quickly to Valeria's point. Let me just clarify that when I talked about no first use, I meant define it in a very narrow way, which is not to use. If it included commitment not to threaten with use, then you might be right. But even so, I would say that Russia might say that we aren't actually threatening anyone. They haven't said that we will use nuclear weapons. They have just said that, well, we might use certain kinds of weapons if we are threatened. We of course know what they mean, but they could argue that they are not, which is I think reinforces my point that these certain policies, which I think coming back to Amy's point, is that these concepts are invented by us. They don't really exist unless we define them, which doesn't make them very useful for situations like this, in my opinion.
Somebody else has a question, please. I'd rather. Just on the question of no first use, it would seems to me, given the fact that all the other NPT nuclear weapon states have policies which define in different ways the exceptional circumstances in which they would consider using nuclear weapons. That to me seems like a more productive way to go forward with an understanding on China rather than focus on no first use. Because in NATO's case, nuclear guarantee means that you would, in some way, use a nuclear weapon to protect the sovereignty of one of our allies. And if you started on that other end and worked from there, would that make an agreement more possible?
If I may jump in first, I think a key constraining factor is China is not interested in discussing other aspects of nuclear issues, except no first use, maybe a couple of other topics. But no first use is really being primarily promoted by China recently. So if we want to initiate some serious dialogue with China, the US or other countries may have to be more receptive to topics that China favors. But I think we can still get to that key problem by talking about no first use. Again, part of the discussion about no first use is to highlight the conventional nuclear linkage. The real concern, the real obstacle for the US to adopt no first use is genuine and growing concerns by US allies about conventional level military aggression. The reason they wanted to preserve the option of first use is they worry that they may face a conventional existential threat. So again, you can use this discussion to highlight those risks and maybe encourage countries to discuss how to address the concern about existential conventional threats. What are the basic common sense principles that can reduce this threat? So I think if we are smart, we can be more open to this discussion and still making the discussion mutually beneficial.
Yes, what Amy said about deterrence also applies to no first use. It's just a concept that can be defined in very different ways. It's not only the only concept out there. Sole purpose is there. What happened to sole purpose?
Kind of an unhappy stepchild, isn't it, of no first use? Well, the thing with no first use is the proposal to make it legally binding, right? That distinguishes it or reifies it in a way the other concepts can't be reified. And so then no first use becomes, well, we agree not to use our nuclear weapons first. So that leaves using them second or third. And so the conditions under which we would use them second are if you violate your no first use pledge, and round we go. So there's a little tautological problem that's difficult to get out of.
But the idea to have no first use as an entry point for negotiations.
For sure.
I think that's an interesting idea to engage China in whatever comes out of this, to enter into negotiations. I think it's a very smart idea.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do to kind of make the most of the opportunity Beijing has presented in February, inviting the United States to talk about no first use. And I think that United States requests for Beijing to come to the arms control negotiation table over the last 10 to 15 years have taken place under conditions of relative stasis. As I said earlier, change is the thing right now. And so what are the nuclear futures, particularly associated with that region, that might that the U.S. might be able to leverage to keep China at the negotiation table, I think is a critical question.
Yeah, the question of whether Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons have been effective or not is an interesting one. I mean, I hear the claim all the time that we are deterred from doing something we want to do because of those threats. Maybe, but I'm not so sure. I mean, we are well aware of the size and capability of Russia's nuclear forces. We also know that there is a line beyond which they would use them, not to start World War III, but to accomplish some limited purpose. We don't know where that line is. Putin probably doesn't know where that line is either. I mean, every country that has nuclear weapons has such a line. One hopes and believes that that threshold is extremely high. The danger is that maybe Putin's threshold is a lot lower than we thought. But I mean, both sides in Ukraine are very far from the maximum escalation they could have with conventional weapons, right? Or they could use chemical weapons. I mean, Russia attacking Kharkiv is an escalation. Ukraine attacking Belgorod is an escalation. I mean, this is going on all the time. I guess what I'm groping for and trying to ask is there something the U.S. wants to do, but is not doing, not because Russia has nuclear weapons, but because of Putin's threats?
No, I wrote a piece with my co-author Alex Montgomery at the start of the war, expressing concern about escalation aversion on the part of the West, that Putin's threats were effectively working just as intended to create more caution on the part of the West, and I think we've seen that play out. I think wars that go on this long inevitably escalate, whether they do in terms of firepower or whether they do in terms of geographic territory. There's no stopping that, right? And so the effect it had was on the pace at which the United States agreed to transfer weapons and technology and training to the Ukrainians. But I think that's also consistent with a broader pattern in US policymaking right now, which is kind of, I think, more precisely called like just loss avoidance, right? Or risk avoidance. This idea that any policy outcome that doesn't smack of winning is really just not palatable right now in the United States. So accepting risk or accepting any % chance of potentially losing in the future is a very difficult sell right now to constituents, to lawmakers, as is anything gray area nuance. And so policy choices just have to smack of winning right now. And so I think the United States has found itself caught within the confines of not only Putin's nuclear threats and aversion to escalation, but also within this broader phenomenon of loss avoidance.
Yes, I can add to that. It's a very interesting question. I would start with the fact that this war is kind of like a textbook example of a limited war that operates under nuclear shadow, so to speak. So it operates under mutual nuclear deterrence, if we understand it as how Guy pointed out, that nuclear weapon deterrence is being used every day because it deters. So the threat remains there, which is a mutual threat to some extent, because while Russia is engaging in nuclear blackmail, Ukraine's supporters have a nuclear deterrent of their own to give them certain freedom to maneuver. So they too give military aid to Ukraine under the protection of their own nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrent. Now, I would say that it's a partial, certainly nuclear coercion has been partially successful for Russia because it has managed to slow down the delivery of certain capabilities. I don't think there is a political or military rationale other than Russian nuclear capability that Ukraine did not receive main battle tanks as soon as it received HIMARS, or jet fighters, or cruise missiles. What has happened instead that there has been a classic case of a salami slicing tactic, where Russia is being tested what it allows. My personal opinion since the beginning of the war that no, there should be no limits, but there have been limits and they have been progressively discarded. Now the reason why this is only a partial success and in a way a failure for Russia is that on the opening day of the invasion, Putin had a speech, and I believe in the speech he said that whoever intervenes, I think the Russian word he used was pameshat or something like that, or perhaps something to the effect. But only hinders, not intervenes. Hinders will face consequences never seen in its history. We have hindered. We have not intervened, but we have certainly put our noses into the war, which Russia wanted to prevent, and it indeed failed in that. But certainly we could have done certain things a lot faster, and I don't see any reason other than nuclear weapons that we haven't done it.
Are there any other questions? Maybe a last question up there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Marina Kralevits, the assistant to the member of the parliament in Ukraine. We're all sitting here in a bright, beautiful place, in a beautiful city, in a beautiful country. And we're discussing here really important things that will probably define the future. But tomorrow I'm taking the flight and then 2 trains back to Kiev, where now the power outages, because the Russian Federation has been attacking the civil infrastructure. There are missile attacks constant on the hospitals, on the maternity guard, like hospitals and so on and so on. And we're talking here about the possible escalations, and the only escalation that is possible, that is left, is that the Russian Federation is using the nuclear bomb against Ukraine. So it's more of the reflection on what has been said here today during the day, is that the only thing that will help you to understand what's happening and what we have to do in the future is for you to go and visit Ukraine, to stay there, for example, overnight, and after it, get back to your bright offices and to work on the policies that will define the future. I think this is what really will help to all of us to understand how to proceed with all the decisions in the future. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think that if Russia decided to actually use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, that would be a fundamental shift of the world order. Since 1992, we've had what we euphemistically called a nuclear taboo against testing, but also since the end of World War II, we haven't had a nuclear weapon used against another country. And I just think that we would be looking at a whole different world order if nuclear weapons are ever used in any place. And I think Putin, for all his rhetoric and for all he's done, I think understands that. I think what we're seeing here is a lot of hyperbole about the use of nuclear weapons. I think we're seeing, again, trying to intimidate and cajole and use that as a tool to get their political objectives. I don't think, of course I could be wrong, but I don't think that the actual use of a nuclear weapon is something that would actually be really seriously considered. And as was mentioned earlier, we have seen no indication that they're actually preparing to use a nuclear weapon in any shape or form. Now, one of the big problems is that the Russians have I've seen various estimates, between 2,000 and 6,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons with a whole range of capability. We have never had a negotiation about restricting that and comparing to what we have in NATO, which is only a few hundred nuclear weapons. There is a very vast disparity, and that could be used as a leverage for gaining a political advantage by the Russians.
Thank you very much. Two more.
I think, at the risk of putting words in your mouth, I think you're reminding us that war is hell, and that the concept of escalation is cold comfort in this situation. So thank you for the reminder.
If I may add quickly, what is worrisome is I tend to believe in case Putin used nuclear weapons, the international community would put no less pressure on Ukraine and its Western supporters as on Russia to stop whatever possible to prevent further escalation of the war. So if we really want to make this risk of nuclear use even smaller, I think the international community need to make a stronger and more united voice, clarifying the consequences on the party that might use nuclear weapons. I don't see enough efforts so far.